Hello, and welcome into the Shopfix channel, a community joined together for the love of woodworking. In this episode, I want to show you how you can build a super simple DIY table saw sled for cross cutting. And there is a lot of videos out there for table saw sled builds, but I noticed that they didn't include some of the tips that I included in the build, so I think this is going to be an easy build, and also it's going to give you an accurate sled that's going to give you 90-degree miters every time. So stick around to watch how to build this super easy DIY table saw sled.
Shopfix. It's for the love of woodworking. Alright, so the first step here is to create the runners for the sled, and we're going to need two to go in both slots on the left and right side of the blade. To create accurate runners, first we'll measure the depth of the slot, and so we can rip that out on our table saw. Now you certainly don't want to transfer the exact measurement, then you might have a board that's a little bit proud out of those slots. So all in all, I would just shoot for about a 30-second underneath the top of the slot. Once we've matched the correct depth of the slot, we're going to move on to match the correct width of the slot. And so we're going to transfer that measure in so we can rip it on our table saw. Now to get runners that sit perfectly within your table saw slots, I would recommend doing a test run on each board that you cut out and going a little bit thinner until you get one that's perfect. Now, I got one that was sliding perfectly, however it got stuck at the end of the table saw slot. And so I checked the other side and I noticed that the table saw slot at the end was a little bit too narrow than the rest of the slot. So I actually had to file that down and then it was perfect. Well, with the table saw still locked into that final measurement that was perfect for the slot, we're going to go ahead and rip out our final runners. After you get these two runners cut out at the final width, you can go ahead and test them out and make sure they slide smoothly between the slots. Now, every good table saw sled needs a sturdy base that's very flat. So in step 2, we're going to create the base for the sled. So let's go ahead and square this base up. I'm going to use my joiner and then rip the other side out with the table saw. Finally, I'll use a miter saw to crosscut both ends square. Well, with this last miter saw cut, we now have a flat, squared up base for our table saw sled. In the third step, we're going to be attaching the runners to the base. So first, you'll need to grab some hardware, like some simple washers, and put them at the bottom of the slot. And this will push out those runners so they sit a little bit proud above the table saw surface. Next, we'll take thin strips of paper so we can wedge them on either side to make that runner sit perfectly in the middle of the slot. Now we'll just take some glue and spread it on the areas where we need to glue the base onto the runners. Once glue is applied to both runners, you can go ahead and take your base and gently set it on top of the runners. You can use your table saw fence as a guide. Then you'll want to apply some weight on the top of the base. Once the glue has had plenty of time to dry, then you can remove the weight and lift up your table saw sled. Then we'll just need to trim off our runners flush to the base. To finish off this step, we're going to go ahead and countersink holes and drive some screws to connect the runners to the base even more securely. Then I would recommend lightly sanding the runners smooth. Now we'll test out how the runners slide between the table saw slots. In step 4, we're going to be creating the back of the sled, and to start this process off, we're going to be cutting it to the correct width. Once we have this board cut to the correct width, we're going to go ahead and glue it to the back of the sled. To make this gluing process a little bit easier, you may want to prop up your table saw sled on a couple of boards. Once the glue has had some time to dry, we're going to flip over our table saw sled and mount some screws from the backside. Well, now that we have the back firmly secured on the base, we can go ahead and flip it over and start to create the kerf of this table saw sled. For this sled, I recommend raising the blade up 2.5 inches before ripping it out on the table saw. You'll want to make sure that you don't cut this kerf all the way through, leave yourself a couple of inches or more. Now that we have the back of the sled complete and fully mounted, we can move on to step 6, which is creating the front of the sled. To begin, we're going to crosscut this board so it's the exact same width as our table saw base. One important thing to note here is that this board is going to have to be completely square because it's going to be the board that's going to be referenced for every cut on this table saw sled. Now we're going to go ahead and clamp this board onto the base and attach it only to one end. After attaching the front board to one side, go ahead and slide your table saw sled back in its slot. The 7th step is one of the most important steps, and that's to create the correct 90-degree angle for the front board that matches the blade. Once you have this properly measured out, you can go ahead and take some double-sided tape, stick it to a very square board, and then you can place it on the base, and it acts as a guide to keep that locked in exactly where you measured. I would gently slide the table saw back out until you can get some clamps underneath the board. Then you'll simply want to gently clamp this board so it doesn't go out of alignment. With the front of the sled now in its correct position, we can fully mount it with screws. With the front fully mounted, we can cut the kerf all the way through the front of the sled. Once this process is complete, you'll want to check to make sure that you're cutting perfect 90-degree angles. If you aren't, you can simply unscrew the front of the sled and then repeat the last steps until you get a perfect 90-degree angle. In the 8th step, we're going to use a 2x4 to create a blade guard at the front of the sled. For this blade guard, I simply added some glue to this 2x4 and glued it right where the blade exits the front of the sled. With this 2x4 blade guard mounted on the front of the sled, the blade will no longer be exposed when cutting with this table saw sled. With the table saw sled complete, we're going to test the sled's accuracy. To test the accuracy, we're going to go ahead and take this flat sheet of MDF that's not square and cross-cut it until it's perfectly square. Once you have your table saw sled locked in at 90 degrees like this one, we can do a lot with it. And it's really easy to add a stop block and cut out identical boards just like I did here. It's also really easy to square up lumber. I hope this video helped you in the creation of your own DIY table saw sled. If you found these tips helpful, don't forget to smash that like button. And if you haven't subscribed to the Shopfix channel, consider subscribing today.